This is the Delhi station of Akashvani. Please stand by for our next program. This is Akashvani. We now bring you the recording of the lecture delivered by Dr. A Surya Prakash, former Chairman Prasar Bharati and Vice Chairman, Executive Committee, Prime Minister Museum and Library on the topic Democracy in Ancient and Modern India.
I shall now begin my lecture on democracy in ancient and modern India. I will say that I have been interested in democracy studies for the last 35 to 40 years, and it has resulted in certain publications by me in regard to the working of democratic institutions in the country and the way it is all shaped out. And also, I've had interest in the democratic traditions of India in the past. And I'm of the view, and I'll come to that later, that straight away, let me put that up front. I will say that India is a secular, liberal, democratic nation because we are civilizationally secular and democratic. That is why we are what we are. That is why we have the constitution we have. So I'll deal with that later after this presentation or at the end of it. So the first point is, so let's straight away go back to the Vedic age. Both the Rig Veda, Atharva Veda refer to the Sabha and Samiti as assemblies which deliberated on issues of state. It advised the king and ministers. Scholars say that the word Janapada is used 40 times in the Rig Veda, 9 times in the Atharva Veda, and several times in the Brahmana texts. The Samiti was an august assembly of a larger group of people for the discharge of political business presided over by the Rajan. The Sabha was a more selective body. Both these assemblies exercised considerable authority and acted as healthy checks on the power of the kings. Great importance was attached not only to the concord between the king and the assembly, but also to a spirit of harmony among members of the assembly. The Sabha and Samiti are described as the two daughters of Prajapati. The Rajan seeks the blessings of both of them. The Yajurveda outlines the coronation oath of the Rajan and a kind of benediction which says, as a ruler from this day onwards, judge the strong and the weak impartially and fairly, strive unceasingly to do good to the people, and above all, protect the country from all calamities. For Vedas, so these are all, observations of scholars who have done deep studies in Sanskrit literature, and they have come to some of these conclusions. The four Vedas provide us the information about political and representative institutions in ancient India. There is enough evidence in the Vedas about people's participation in decision making and the reliance on collective wisdom. There is considerable information in our ancient texts on Janapadas, village councils, and Ganasanghas. So the point is that we go back at least 2,500 years, somewhere from 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, you had the core ideas of democracy flourishing in many of these societies at that time in India. Panini's grammar of Sanskrit, Ashtadhyayi, uses the term Janapada 13 times and refers by name to 18 Janapadas. Lichavis and Shakyas are ancient examples of self-governing communities. Different forms of governance coexisted. These terms you hear today, in regular debates on democracy: Loktantra, Janatantra, Prajatantra, Ganatantra, that is republic, and Rajatantra, communities that had elected representatives and elected kingships. The kings were bound by the common law of dharma. In later centuries, even when he was the sovereign ruler of the state, the king did not enjoy any exemption from the code of conduct of dharma. In fact, the Dharma Shastra puts the strictest restrictions on the arbitrary use of power by the state. The Dharma Shastras outline a detailed list of royal duties. It's called Rajadharma. Thus, the king was not an uncommon and extraordinary individual who was above the rules of dharma, which in effect constituted law in ancient India. He was expected to be the most sincere, polite, and benevolent servant of his subjects. So the theory and practice of government was largely republican. largely Republican in nature, entailing the expression of the alternative idea of government through an assembly representing the larger section of people, say scholars. So the ancient Indian kingship may be clearly understood through the sublime and conspicuous democratic, responsive, accountable, and law-abiding character of the kings. So, in Kalidasa's Abhigyan Shakuntalam, there is a reference to democratic traditions. The right to democracy is absolute and without any discrimination. This is testimony to the democratic values in administration in ancient India. So, here is a quote from Kalidasa's Raghuvansham about the qualities of the king. As he was free from avarice, his subjects became prosperous. As he dispelled their fears of obstacles, they performed their religious rites, and he corrected them. They had in him a father, and as he smoothed away their grief, they had in him a son as well. Political science literature in India is full of democratic traditions in Greece and Athens. How I wish we were introduced to these truths, which I am talking about now, about republics in India when we were in school and college. And we were taught about the evidence of democratic traditions in the Vedas and the Mahabharata. This is something that has been absolutely missing, as I see in the first 75 years after independence. It wasn't there during the British period, colonial period, and one can well understand that. But what happened after 1947, August 15th, is something which is truly tragic in terms of our understanding of our own culture and civilization. So we come to Kautilya's Arthashastra. So it presents a highly exalted idea of kingship. In the happiness of his population rests the ruler's happiness. In their welfare lies his welfare. He shall not necessarily consider as good whatever pleases him, but he shall consider as good whatever pleases his population. Look at this. You please spend a minute on this particular slide. The Arthashastra gives us insights into the strong welfare state that existed during the Mauryan Empire. He says seeds, provisions, loans must be provided to peasants at the time of famine. State must help in agricultural operations, provide exemption from agriculture tax to peasants who rejuvenate tanks and water bodies. Money lenders will be told to give exemptions on rate of interest to borrowers who are students and those in socio-economic distress. The state has to pay special attention to destitute children, women in need of help, widows, and protection of minors. Senior citizens and the poor must be central to state policy. Their concern must be central to state policy. So, this brings us to the question of, this differential rate of interest. I remember I had then joined the Indian Express in Bangalore, and I traveled, sir, extensively with Chief Minister Devrajars in the 70s. And every month he would go to the far-flung districts of the state and look at welfare schemes and so on. And Indira Gandhi had issued a 20-point program, many of them related to social welfare. In India, if there was one chief minister who took that program seriously, it was Devrajars. And I had the opportunity of traveling with him extensively, and I found that he would insist on a differential rate of interest for farmers, especially in the drought-affected areas and so on and so forth. So, I'm now talking of Arthashastra and what is being said there, millennia ago, in regard to differential rate of interest, concern for farmers, especially in conditions of famine and so on. And in later days, we saw this operating in terms of the policies of the governments in India. And of course, I'll come to the directive principles of state policy. Tax concessions to students in gurukulas, hermits, and individuals who are visually or orally challenged. This is Arthashastra. State must protect the rights of workers to fair wages, right of free movement of people, right to medical aid, and such other social, economic, and political rights that citizens ought to have. That is why Ambedkar said, mere political freedom will not do. We need to have, social equality. mere political equality will not do. We need social equality, economic equality. All these are precepts which were there in this country millennia ago. And I can see at least 5 articles which are loaded in favor of the working class in our constitution. This is part of the constitution and it has a strong socialist tilt. So, the Arthashastra and directive principles. All of this and much more stands incorporated in Part 4 of the Constitution under the head Directive Principles of State Policy. Article 38. The state to secure a social order for the promotion of welfare of people, justice, social, economic and political shall inform all institutions. The state shall strive to minimize inequalities in income. Article 39. The state shall direct policy to ensure ownership and control of material resources are so distributed as best to subserve the common good. Operation of economic system does not result in concentration of wealth and means of production. Health and strength of workers, tender age of children not abused. Children have opportunity to develop in a healthy manner. Given these extracts from the Arthashastra of Kautilya, going back to 300 BC, that is 2300 years ago, is it not absurd for us to teach students in our schools and colleges that the directive principles of state policy were picked up from the Irish constitution or some other constitution, or that the principles of a socialistic pattern of society came from the Soviet Union or some Western thinkers? It is possible that our constitution makers were influenced by the wording of these provisions in other constitutions, but the truth is that the marma and dharma embedded there is entirely drawn from our civilizational experience. The Irish were certainly not the originators of the directive principles of state policy. Kautilya certainly was. As stated earlier, if we look within, we will find these principles going back around 2 millennia within India. So then Article 42 says, that is our constitution today, provision of just human conditions of work and maternity relief. You know, maternity leave has gone up from 12 months to 26 months in India today. And I think India is one of the leading countries in regard to taking care of women at the time of childbirth. In fact, pregnant women and subsequently after childbirth, the initiatives that have been taken by government. And this is what the Constitution expects our governments to do. Article 43, living wage and better conditions of work for workers and leisure. Article 43A is workers' participation in management. Then I come to Arthashastra and directive principles. Granville Austin says the purpose of directive principles was to find a middle way between individual liberty and public good. B. N. Rao, who drafted the principles, said directive principles were moral precepts for the authorities of the state. K. N. Panikar says the directive principles seek to usher in economic democracy as envisaged by B. R. Ambedkar, who said mere political democracy is not enough. So, some legal doctrines. This is the doctrine of escheat. In Indian law, doctrine of escheat is embedded in section 29 of the Hindu Succession Act, which provides for failure of heirs. That is, if a person dies without leaving a will and without having heirs. So this doctrine comes into play. It says if an intestate, that's a person who had died without leaving a will, if an intestate has left no heir qualified to succeed to his or her property in accordance with the provisions of this act, such property shall devolve on the government, and the government shall take over property along with obligations, etc. However, the doctrine of escheat was not unknown to India. Manu referred to it in his laws, that is in chapter 9, which say that the king has the right to all the properties belonging to persons who die without leaving an heir. King Dushyanta and the doctrine of escheat. This is very, very important because we have been told, I have been told in law college that many of these things have come. We have learned this from the British, and this has to be challenged. These kind of conclusions which have prevailed in our education and in our curricula for the last 200 years. So this is Abhigyan Shakuntala Act 6. King Dushyanta is informed that a merchant who has huge wealth and who is childless, has died on the high seas. The minister tells the minister that king that as per existing law, the merchant's estate must go to the state. However, at this juncture, the king asks if any of the merchant's wives is pregnant. He said, let inquiry be made. There may be a wife who is with a child. He is told that one of the merchant's wives is soon to become a mother. On learning this, the king pronounces his judgment. The king awards the estate to the child in the womb. He also declares that henceforth he is ever ready to play the role of the departed kinsman to the bereaved families. So, the rights of the unborn are also there in our other laws. This is called a child in utero. This principle stands incorporated in Transfer of Property Act and Hindu Succession Act. Section 20 of Hindu Succession Act says a child who was in the womb at time of death of an intestate and subsequently born alive shall have the same rights as if he existed when that person died. So that is there. Then therefore, under Section 20, a child in the womb who has come into existence will be entitled share of the property only if the child is in the womb at the time of death of the estate owner and the child is born alive. Now here again, this was something, you see, that this was something that we presumed was something we picked up in our laws from British laws. I was told in law college that escheat was a doctrine that was borrowed from English law, that it was a remnant of the English feudal system of land tenure, and this concept was known in common law as bona vacantia. Then, the Lichavi, Yodeha and Ambasta republics are Ganasangas. The head of state and other important functionaries were elected. The Aitreya Brahmana records the emergence of Hindu republics around 1000 BC. Membership of the Central Assembly was as high as 5,000 among the Yudhayas and 7,707 among the Lichavis. Meetings were characterized by harmonious debates and the opinion of the elders was sought. So there are elements of bicameralism even at that stage because there was some process of consultation of elders. Then we come to the Assembly of the Ambasta Republic first appointed generals to oppose Alexander, but later accepted the advice of their elders and decided to make peace proposals. So this is where I am talking about bicameralism or the first signs of bicameralism. The Lichavi Gana Rajya, the assembly elected the Rajan, the Uparajan, the Senapati and the Bandagatika, that's the treasurer, the key administrative posts. There were also several other posts which are filled through process of election. These included posts which were needed to administer and run the assembly itself, like the Asana Pannapaka, who was the first to be elected. He had the responsibility to ensure proper seating arrangements of members. The elders and members rich in experience were the first to be seated. This is much like the arrangement in our parliament, where former prime ministers and MPs of long standing are allotted seats in the front row. I remember Indrajit Gupta, who was elected to the Lok Sabha 9 times, would always have a front row seat, irrespective of which party had won the elections and who was ruling this country. So also is the case with Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Chandrasekhar and so on. So these are ideas which I find were there in the Lichavi Republic some 2,500, 3,000 years ago. The first thing they did was to elect this Asana Pannapaka. His job was to make the seating arrangements, and all the elders and women of experience were to find their place in the front row. Then election of parliamentary officials. Election of parliamentary officials. The second to be elected was the person who was to move the resolutions. The third person to be elected was the Salaka Gahapaka, whose job was to conduct elections or record voting in the assembly. He distributed the Salaka, that is the ballot made of wood which would have a red or black mark. A member voting in favor of the motion would pick up red and a member voting against would pick up black. The collection of votes was called Salaka Grahana. So, India was studied with republics 2,500, 3,000 years ago. These were republics, meaning they elected their head of state as distinct from a monarchy. And In regard to republics, I regard republics to be far superior to monarchies and more in tune with democratic principles than monarchies. Therefore, India as a republic, in my view, has a much superior democratic status than the United Kingdom, which has at the moment King Charles as the head of state. Because a republic ensures that a Ramnath Kovind or a Draupadi Murmu, who hail from communities which have been socially, educationally, economically backward for long years, can be head of state. Apart from the United Kingdom, there are many nations in Europe and Scandinavia which have hereditary heads of state who practice what I regard as Parivarvad and which is accepted by the people in those countries. In the course of my studies over the years, democracy studies, I have examined over 80 constitutions across the world, and I must tell you that a lot of these nations, which are now regarded as very modern, progressive, and prosperous nations, they have very defective democratic traditions, unlike India. So, unlike these nations, where some individuals and families are more equal than others, the Indian Republic guarantees equality before law and the equal protection of the law, that is Article 14, no discrimination, Article 15, on the grounds of religion, language, gender, caste, creed, or place of birth, and all the fundamental rights under Article 19. So, rule of law. In the Lichavi Republic, every case was decided on merits. The status of the person or community, that is the Kula, he belonged to, did not matter. The punishment was in proportion to the crime, and the same rule applied to everyone. We have often heard the Supreme Court quote Thomas Fuller's Pity Aphorism to a person who holds or has held an important public office and say, "Be ye ever so high, the law is above you." This is the core principle in Article 14, which guarantees equality before law and the equal protection of law. There was a highly developed and advanced legal system and constitutionalism in India around 6,000 years before Christ. So, King Dushyanta and Article 14. Abhijnana Shakuntalam, a young student in the Gurukul objects to the king killing a deer as it belongs to the ashram. The king bows to the young student's diktat. The student says, "O king, this deer belongs to the ashram and must not be killed." The king says, "Stop the chariot." The student, "Restore your arrow to the quiver. You are given weapons, but not to strike the innocent." The king says, "It is done." The hermit says, "A deed worthy of you, a shining example of kings." The king says, "We must not disturb the ashram." He asks the charioteer to stop the chariot at a distance. Then the king says one should wear modest garments when entering an ashram. "Take these jewels and bow," he says, and gives them to the charioteer. Important to note that this signifies the principle of rule of law and equality before law. The judicial system was multi-tiered in ancient India, much like the present day. At the lower level was the Kulaka court. The decisions of this court were subject to higher jurisdiction. Decisions of this court could be appealed against before the Gana court, that is the judicial body constituted by the assembly. The Gana court decision was subject to the appellate jurisdiction of the ruler or monarch. Also, the doctrine of res judicata was adhered to. Citizenship rules were well developed, including rules pertaining to grant of citizenship to outsiders. Res judicata. Res judicata is a principle which says a cause of action cannot be re-litigated in the same forum once it has been judged on merits. In other words, a losing plaintiff cannot re-sue a winning defendant on the same cause of action, which however does not preclude appeals before a higher court. Reopening of closed matter was regarded as a crime. Section 11 of the Indian Civil Procedure Code says a court shall not hear any suit or issue in which the matter directly or substantially in issue has been directly and substantially in issue in a former suit between the same parties litigating under the same title in a court competent to try such subsequent suit. I had learnt it by rote very recently to take my law exams. Doctrine of separation of powers has been well developed in ancient India. There was clear demarcation of the powers of legislature, the executive, and the judicial wing of the state. The purpose was to ensure checks and balances. So, Section 11 of the Civil Procedure Code, this is provided in 7th Amendment to the US Constitution, also the 5th Amendment that protects citizens from double jeopardy. We were taught in law school that res judicata emerged as a concept in English common law system and adopted by other nations which follow judge-made law or law based on precedents, and in nations which follow civil law that is codified in a statute or in a constitution. We were never told that this prevailed in India 3000 years ago. This is the tragedy of our education system, which has remained a slave to Macaulay. Separation of powers. Doctrine of separation of powers. Our political science and law textbooks attribute the doctrine of separation of powers to Montesquieu's noted work, The Spirit of the Laws, published in the 18th century, and that the seeds of the idea were present in the writings of the 16th century French theologian and reformer John Calvin. But there is little reference to the presence of this doctrine in ancient India. Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers influenced the American Constitution makers, and it is one of the core ideas in the American Constitution. The parliamentary procedure in ancient India was advanced. Actually, when I came into journalism, I was told that there is a book called May's Parliamentary Practice, and one must read that to understand parliament procedure. And then, of course, we had Kaul and Shakta produce the Indian version of May's Parliamentary Practice. But we were never taught that the parliamentary procedure in ancient India was quite advanced. The Salaka Gahapaka collected the ballots, counted them, and announced the result of the voting to the assembly. Those who could not attend a meeting were allowed to vote by proxy, subject to rules. Cantankerous speeches were prohibited, as also pointless observations. The clerks of the house recorded proceedings. The assembly had a quorum rule. There were, however, differing views about the strength of the assembly. It varies from 999, that is Indian scholars, to 5000, Greek chroniclers. In contrast, Greek Athenian democracy has had larger assemblies, but attendance was low. The rules provided for proxy voting, issue of whips, reference to committees, different systems of voting including voice vote and balloting. Parliamentary procedure in ancient India was advanced. Everything was decided by majority. Voting was open or secret, depending on the decision of the assembly. There were three kinds of voting: secret, whispering, and open. The assembly had a teller who would distribute the voting sticks. They were colored wooden sticks. Those voting in favor of the motion picked up sticks with the red mark. Those voting against the motion chose sticks with the black mark. The decision of the full assembly was final. The minutes of the meetings were recorded. This included the deliberations of the decisions taken. Before final passage, the main thrust of the resolution was repeated by the chair 3 times so that there could be no confusion. In fact, even now, when I cover parliament and watch the proceedings in state assemblies, I find the speaker say that 3 times as to exactly what is being passed. So, parliamentary procedure in ancient India, this is like the passage of bills in parliament, which has to be voted at the introduction stage, the consideration stage, and the final reading, where the speaker says, those in favor may say aye, those against may say no. The present speaker, of course, says all this in Hindi. Often the majority view is determined by the speaker on the basis of his auditory perception of where the majority lay. Also, parliamentary procedure was rather advanced. It provided for quorum, proxy voting, issue of whips, different systems of voting, including voice vote and balloting. Parliamentary procedure in ancient India was advanced. In the Lichavi Ganasangha assembly, the rule was that those in favor remained silent. Those who opposed the motion stood up to speak. This was another form of voice vote which enabled the presiding officer to determine the majority. In today's Lok Sabha, the Secretary General, other senior officials of the Lok Sabha Secretariat carry out the functions of the Asana Pannapaka and Salaka Gahapaka, who decide seating arrangements, the counting of votes where a motion is put before the House, and hand out slips to members when the electronic device malfunctions in the House. There aren't any red and black wooden ballots, but members have to press either the green, red, or orange button to decide their support, opposition, or abstention during a vote. There are also turbaned marshals who are constantly by the speaker's side and whispering advice into his ears even as the proceedings are on. Here the rule was that those in favor remained silent, those who opposed the motion stood up to speak. And there was another form of voice out which enabled the presiding officer to determine the majority. Parliamentary rules in Buddhist assemblies. The rules of procedure and debates in the meetings of Buddhist Sangha were modeled on those of the assemblies of the Gana or Sangha states. A Buddhist chapter required a quorum of 20. It is likely that a similar rule prevailed in meetings of political Sangha. Panini refers to Ganatitha as the person whose attendance completed the quorum in a Gana, and to Sangatitha as one who completed the quorum in the Sangha. A person who acted as whip to secure the quorum is described as the Ganaparaka or Mahavagga. In Panini 3, you can read more about that. An officer in charge of allocation of seats, and then the Sangha Mukhya regulated the debate. He was to observe strict impartiality, otherwise he was furiously criticized. In the Buddhist Sangha, motion was thrice proposed and passed. Even today, if you see our assemblies and parliament, the speaker says, those in favor may say aye, those who against may say no, and he does that 3 times so that there is no confusion about person who is voting and where he or she wants to vote. Then we come to parliamentary rules in Buddhist assemblies. Buddhist Sanghas adopted parliamentary rules that prevailed in the Gana Sanghas. They had parliamentary rules and a requirement of quorum, whips, voting by ballot, etc. Dr. Ambedkar referred to this in his concluding remarks on the Constitution on November 25, 1949 in the Constituent Assembly. He wanted to make it clear that democratic practices were not alien to the people of Bharat. Dr. Ambedkar said, it is not that India did not know what is democracy. There was a time when India was studded with republics. It is not that India did not know parliaments or parliamentary procedure. A study of Buddhist Bhikshu Sanghas discloses that not only there were parliaments, but the Sanghas knew and observed all the rules of parliamentary procedure known to modern times. And Dr. Ambedkar, these are his concluding remarks on this subject. He says, they had rules regarding all that which I described just now. They had rules regarding seating arrangements, rules regarding motions, resolutions, quorum, whips, voting by ballot, censure motion, res judicata, etc. The Buddha must have borrowed them from the rules of political assemblies functioning in the country at that time. He concludes, that is, Dr. Ambedkar concludes by lamenting that India lost this democratic system. I am of the view that the Islamic invasions and then the other intrusions that happened and disturbed our society and civilization for about 1200 or 1300 years completely disrupted this system, and this is one great opportunity for us after independence, for us to regain this civilizational strength and this enormous gift that actually India has given to the world in terms of democratic traditions. So now we come to the king in Europe and in India. The Europeans believed in the divinity of the king. Alexander the Great was deified. Roman emperors were deified. The monarchy was regarded as divinely ordained institutions, and kings were accountable to God alone. It was believed that even bad kings were divine and responsible to God alone. Blackstone, the English jurist, went so far as to say that the king is not only incapable of doing wrong, but also of thinking wrong. So the king in Europe and in India, this was not the case in India. Only good and pious kings were regarded as divine by ancient Hindus. Bad and impious ones were dubbed as demoniac. In the republics of ancient Greece and Rome, the franchise was confined to a small minority who governed a vast majority. Democracy was a reality only with reference to the small class of full-fledged citizens in Europe, not the whole population. In the medieval Republic of Venice, the franchise was confined to the strictly limited aristocracy, which itself was dominated by a small oligarchy. In Netherlands, a very small body of butchers had the franchise. So also France, England, no franchise for women even in the 19th until the beginning of the 20th century. So the king in ancient India and the president of India. The king in ancient India was like the president of the Indian Republic. This is my view. Final source of executive power and legislative power and at times judicial power. All executive decisions are taken in the name of the president. The president can sign an ordinance and bring a law into force. His signature is necessary to give effect to a law made by parliament. The president can grant pardon to a person convicted and sentenced to imprisonment. In fact, he can even pardon those who are on death row. The king in ancient times too enjoyed all these powers. Plurality of thought in ancient India. Ekam sat vipra bahuda vadanti. This is Rigveda. The truth is one, but the wise perceive it differently. In my view, this embodies the universalism of Hinduism. Then comes another shloka, Ano Bhadra Kratavo Yantu Vishwataha, meaning let noble thoughts come to us from all directions. This is Rigveda 1.89.1. Then the third shloka, Ayam Niji Paroveti Ganana Laguchetasam Udara Charitanam tu Vasudaiva Kutumbakam. This is from the Maha Upanishad 6.71 to 75. You hear Prime Minister Narendra Modi talking about Vasudaiva Kutumbakam quite often. In fact, among our Prime Ministers, and I've had the opportunity and privilege of getting to know many of them and listening to many of them, starting with Indira Gandhi in 1971. But I must say that Modi ji is probably the first Prime Minister who is so focused on this central idea that emanates from Bharat, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and what that means actually. So, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, let noble thoughts come to us from all sides, is indicative of tolerance, the state having no religion, plurality of thought in ancient India. Please see the connection of these shlokas and Article 25, the fundamental right to profess, practice and propagate religion. Article 28, no religious instruction in educational institutions fully funded by the state, often quoted by scholars for projecting Hinduism as a tolerant religion. In fact, when you look at the fundamental rights chapter in our constitution, whether it is Article 14, Article 15, 19, all the provisions in Article 19, 21, 25, 26, to profess, practice, propagate religion, and to run religious institutions, 29, 30, that is to have your own script, culture, and so on, and to have institutions to manage them. Article 28, no religious instruction in education institutions fully funded by the state. As I said, I have studied dozens of constitutions across the world, and I am of the view that there is no constitution in the world which has this basket of rights for the minorities. There is no other constitution in the world. It is so comprehensive that is simply unbelievable. And where does this come from? In my view, it comes from the fact that we are citizens of Bharat, and Bharat has had all these traditions going back to 3,000 years or more. So our constitution actually is the sarancha of the great thoughts that were there millennia ago. Now, according to scholars, the mantra shows the willingness of Vedic people and culture to receive noble and worthy ideas, thoughts, works from all quarters, from all parts of the universe. Ano Bhadra Kratavo Yantu Vishwataha. Let noble thoughts come to us from all directions. This verse emphasizes the complementarity of human knowledge. It highlights the need to learn from all the directions because knowledge is not the monopoly of any single individual or nation or race. The pursuit and expansion of knowledge is in the widest sense of the word is a collective human endeavor. That is why Hindu kingdoms did not impose jizya or a tax on those practicing other religions. There is enough evidence in ancient India to show that it believed in a pluralistic society. It emphasizes liberty, equality, fraternity. I am Niji Paroveti, Ganana Laguchetasa. liberty, equality, fraternity. If you see that in our constitution today, you will realize that its source is here. The three fundamentals of our democracy, which are embedded in the preamble of our constitution. Without these three, how can you envisage the entire world as a family? The British, through their system of education and governance, sought to disconnect modern India from her past. The educational curriculum was designed in such a way that many historians and commentators were of the view that Indians were a savage race, devoid of history, culture, and dignity, and had to be civilized, quote unquote. As Macaulay said in his infamous minute in 1824, Indians had to be taught the English language and the British mores and manners. Macaulay Putras, that is, Indians who studied in Macaulay's convents, fell into this trap and began deriding everything that personified Bharat. The Hindu religion, the Hindu pantheon, the worship of Ganga as the mother and giver of life, the worship of flora and fauna, and the attribution of divinity to various facets of the environment. The British mocked at us for worshipping what they called the monkey god or the elephant god, snakes and peacocks. And the brown sahibs, anxious to curry favor with the colonizers, began doing the same. All this was pagan culture, and you would be regarded as an evolved being if you mocked at your own reality, your Hinduness, your culture, and your language, ridiculing Hindu gods and goddesses, Hindu practices and rites and rituals. We all know what happened in the 1940s. The Muslims of United India demanded and secured an independent Islamic state. After partition, the Hindus of India, who constituted 88% of the population, chose to have a secular, liberal, democratic nation. This must be acknowledged by all Indians and global citizens. This is critical to social harmony in the country. India is a secular, democratic nation because we are civilizationally secular and democratic. This too must be acknowledged wholeheartedly. I think this is very critical in our journey of 75 years, and I am more or less of that age. So I have seen the rise of India soon after independence, that is from the time our constitution came into being. In fact, I am a constitutional child in that sense because I was born in 1950, soon after we adopted the constitution. And from then on, of course, I opened my eyes to the world 10 or 15 years later. And I must tell you that I have seen India's journey, our economic, social, and other situation in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the way we have progressed and how far we have come. And all this has been possible because we are a secular, democratic, liberal nation. And why are we a secular, liberal, democratic nation? I argue that that is because of our civilizational strength and that core which is there in our civilization. And I am also of the view that all Indians, and I repeat this, all Indians must acknowledge this fact that India is a secular democratic nation because we are civilizationally secular and democratic. So long as you keep challenging this, so long as you keep saying that this has come from somewhere else, you are not going to have social harmony in this country. It is very important. You must acknowledge this. This is the truth. I am sorry to say that there isn't sufficient acknowledgement of this until now because of the disdain that the Nehruvians have had for our civilization. This has been the source of social tension, according to me, in this country. I am also of the view that given our civilizational strengths, India will remain a secular, liberal, democratic nation only so long as it remains an overwhelmingly Hindu majority nation. I have no confusion about this, having studied this whole problem over many decades. Swami Vivekananda had prophesied that one day India would rise and shake off the colonial yoke, not just in political terms, but also psychologically as well. I think that day has come. India has now entered an era of self-recognition and self-respect. The Macaulays, at least for the moment, have returned to their barracks and will hopefully remain there. And the self-confident Atmanirbhar Bharatiyas have finally taken charge. So much so that I am able to dredge up this truth today in the precincts of an institution that had provided for many decades a platform primarily to Nehruvians and every individual who derided what our civilization stood for. It's a measure of the times we are living in that I have been heard with patience in these hallowed precincts today, something that would not have happened if I had delivered this lecture 20 years ago. So thank you very much and namaskar.
You were listening to the recording of the lecture delivered by Dr. A. Surya Prakash, former Chairman Prasar Bharati, Vice Chairman, Executive Committee, Prime Minister Museum and Library, on the topic Democracy in Ancient and Modern India. This broadcast came to you from the Delhi station of Akashvani.